Opening a frontier wasn't the exciting adventure we imagined. Mostly it was hard, backbreaking work. You spent all your time clearing trees and brushes and boulders from the fields, grubbing out roots, building fences, houses, and barns, plowing, planting, weeding, and hoping to harvest. And as if the work weren't enough, pioneering was a lonely kind of life. Settlers were often cut off from each other, as well as from the towns and the churches and the schools that enrich life in the more settled areas. The mountain men of early Utah seemed to thrive in such circumstances, but then few, if any of them, ever intended to settle down in the wilderness for any length of time. And surely the frenetic activity of their annual rendezvous suggests how lonely they really were, and how delighted they were at the chance to socialize with one another at least once a year. In the end, most of them returned to the east and settled down to the comforts of civilization. While the mountain men were reaping Utah's first harvest of valuable beaver pelts, a young man half a continent away was embarking on a search for a less worldly kind of treasure. His search would lead to the founding of a new religion, which, unlikely though it seems, was greatly to influence Utah's history. Joseph Smith formally organized his followers into a religious body in 1830. The same year, another famous Smith, Jedediah, left the Rocky Mountains for the last time. 16 stormy years later, the Salt Lake Valley, which Jedediah Smith had called his home in the wilderness, was to become again a home in the wilderness, this time for several thousand of Joseph Smith's followers. With all the energy and collective efficiency of the beehive, which they chose as their symbol, they set about the task of taming the wilderness. Get up, get up, get up. Come on, get up. Come on. Come on. Come on, girl. There we go. The Latter-day Saint or Mormon movement had its beginnings in the family of Joseph Smith Sr. The Smiths were a farm family who joined a considerable migration from New England to upstate New York in 1816. Though pious, they didn't associate with organized religions until about 1820, when waves of revivalistic enthusiasm began to sweep into the towns in their vicinity. Joseph's mother, two of his brothers, and a sister joined the Presbyterians. The patriarch of the family remained aloof from organized religion. 15-year-old Joseph Jr. leaned toward the Methodists, but found himself confused by the conflicting claims of the various revivalists. Deeply disturbed by the increasing fragmentation of his world, he sought a resolution by praying in this grove near his father's farm. Here he had a religious experience that would first transform his own life, then that of his family, and eventually the lives of thousands of followers. The direction of that transformation seems clear. Smith's movement would attempt to resist, even reverse, the trend toward individualism and disorder in the exuberant young America of the 1830s. The Mormons, as they would come to be known, would strive to build an enclave of order and unity in a world they came to view as increasingly chaotic and fragmented. Smith's America was filled with such maxims as, "It's a free country, ain't it?" or "Every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost." People who held to such sentiments would resist Smith's movement with all the means at their command. And as often happens, that very resistance would serve to convince Smith's followers of the rightness of their beliefs. This opposition would also increase their solidarity and cause them to insulate themselves from others. Thus, strength obtained through adversity helped them approach the degree of unity and order Smith had envisioned. The historical experience of the Mormons reinforced Smith's teachings and moved them, even after the founding prophet was dead, toward social values counter to those of the nation. Let me give you an example. My stepfather's a rugged individualist, born and raised on a frontier ranch in western Colorado. And whenever his Mormon friends try to convert him, he sets his jaw and firmly maintains that nobody's going to tell me what to do. Well, one of the differences between the Mormons and the broader American society is that Mormons do let certain people tell them what to do. The difficult settlement of northern Arizona provides an extreme example of this kind of obedience. In 1876, Levi M. Savage was called on a church mission to leave Utah and help settle Arizona. 43 years later, not Savage, but one of his children, wrote to the church president asking if their father could be released from his mission to return to Utah, which he'd long wanted to do. The release came promptly, and Levi Savage, age 70, finally left Arizona to retire in Salt Lake City. Levi Savage was a man who let certain people tell him what to do. Mormon history is full of similar examples of willing and tenacious obedience to church authority, a trait still evident among this people today. How, in a land where individual liberty is so highly prized, did a whole people become so remarkably obedient to authority? Well, I think part of the answer must lie in the new doctrinal teachings they received, as well as the historical experience of the Mormons in the eastern states and in the Midwest. One of Joseph Smith's distinctive early teachings was that he had been called by God to be a prophet in the last days. While others might receive private counsel and revelation from God, there was only one who had been given the authority to speak for God to all mankind. Joseph Smith's revelations were often written down and accepted by his followers as scripture. This concept of continuing revelation was very important because it introduced an element of valuable flexibility in church doctrine, and it also clothed church policies in the language and in the authority of Holy Writ. And so, in this respect, I find the Mormons to be quite unusual, but not only in matters of authority. My Colorado-born stepfather, though a little appalled that grown men would let others tell them what to do, also told me of his efforts to build an irrigation ditch on the ranch where he grew up. He worked alone, year after year, scraping and hauling dirt, but never did quite get the project finished. A group of Mormon neighbors, on the other hand, worked together and completed a canal sufficient to irrigate all their fields in just a few weeks. Mormons are often criticized for mixing mainly with one another while ignoring others. The other side of this coin is that they are a communal people, closely knit, and therefore adept at completing community projects. There was much in their early history that tended to strengthen this trait. Shortly after moving the New York congregations to Ohio in 1831, Smith received a revelation that Jackson County, Missouri, on the then western frontier would be the central gathering place for Mormons. Some of his followers began that summer to move to Missouri. For the next 7 years, there were really two main areas of Mormon activity: Kirtland, Ohio, and a succession of Missouri sites. Teachings and events in each area strengthened the Mormon sense of cooperative community. In Kirtland, the Mormon prophet introduced a new doctrine reinforcing this sense of community, that of the gathering. Converts to Mormonism in the 1830s quickly learned that conversion exacted more than just a spiritual change in their lives. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, as well as farm villages of the northeastern states, church leaders urged recent converts to sell their possessions and gather with the saints, preferably in Missouri, but Kirtland would do as well. This concept implied that the non-Mormon world was subject to corruption and influences from which the faithful must flee. The gathering thus accomplished a physical separation of Mormons from others. It also widened the doctrinal rift between the world of the saints, as they called themselves, and that of non-Mormons. Particularly important in this process was the beginning of a cooperative economic system called the Law of Consecration and Stewardship, practiced mainly in Missouri. This system was first described in a revelation received in February 1831, very shortly after Smith's arrival in Kirtland. Under it, new converts gave all their property to the church upon joining. After that, all surpluses beyond a basic provision of family needs were also given to the church at the end of each year. These consecrations paid for stewardships or the materials needed to practice a trade and house a family. consecrations also provided for the poor and met financial needs of church administration. Supply and demand still set the price of goods and services, yet the consecrated surplus provided a fund which would be used by church leaders to shape and plan for balanced economic growth of the whole community. The program was a revision of the increasing individualism apparent in America at the time. It led toward a more communal economics, but left individual opportunity and responsibility clearly in place. As practiced in Missouri between 1831 and 1833, the law of consecration and stewardship caused a certain amount of friction within the community. Some held back on their consecrations, irritating those who had given freely. Joseph Smith was later to substitute what he called the lesser law of tithing. Nonetheless, by asking individuals to systematically make sacrifices for community needs and goals, this brief practice of the system helped Mormons to lessen the distinctions they made between secular and religious aspects of their lives. Perhaps even more important in establishing a strong feeling of community among the early saints was the construction of the Kirtland Temple. The impoverished saints made great sacrifices to erect the building. Women worked long hours spinning wool to provide clothing for the workers. When it was time to plaster the sandstone exterior, many gave their china and glassware to be ground into plaster so the walls would glisten in the sun. Dedication services were held in March of 1836. Many participants testified that they heard angelic choirs and experienced other heavenly manifestations. The building became a visible symbol of the sacrifice of individual needs for the good of the whole, and remains one of Ohio's finest 19th century church buildings. The sense of community it represented was heightened when Joseph Smith began to teach that the Mormons were, in fact, a latter-day Israel. "Ye are the children of Israel and the seed of Abraham," Mormons were told in an 1834 revelation. They accordingly began in Kirtland to see themselves as a latter-day covenant people with a special relationship to God and with special obligations to Him. In all these ways, the Mormons became identified as not just members of a new religious denomination, but citizens of a community that exacted a degree of loyalty and commitment uncommon among religious bodies of the time. That sense of community was to prove vitally important to settlement of Utah in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. It facilitated the cooperative building of dams, ditches, and canals, the fencing of fields, and the completion of all the other labors necessary to settlement in the Great Basin. These qualities were already apparent in the Mormon character in the 1830s, but they were reinforced by the experiences they had in the Midwest. In Ohio, Missouri, and in Illinois, the Mormons tended to be clannish and to mix religion, economics, and politics. They thus alienated the earlier settlers, which led to distrust and finally violent persecution. The Missouri migrations had begun in the summer of 1831, shortly after Smith had designated Jackson County the site of the American Zion, or principal gathering place. Things went well, but as Mormons began to pour into the area, earlier settlers, mainly from Kentucky and Tennessee, began to fear the growing influence of these Yankees. The Mormons started publishing a newspaper. They opened shops. It seemed they would soon gain political control of the area. Worse, they were free soilers and had converted some free blacks. They had also announced their intention to fraternize with the Indians and convert them to Mormonism if possible. Greatly disturbed by all these developments, the old settlers rose up against the Mormons in July of 1833. They destroyed the Mormon press, the store, and the blacksmith shop. They tarred and feathered prominent church leaders. Opposition became so intense that in November the Latter-day Saints were forced out of the county. They crossed the Missouri northward into Clay County, where local residents provided food and temporary shelter. Upon hearing of the expulsion, Joseph Smith led a party of about 200 from Kirtland to help restore church members to their lands. The expedition, called Zion's Camp, failed in its primary aim to reinstate the saints. It did, however, provide valuable experience in group migration, which would later serve the Mormons well. Eventually, a gentleman's agreement was made by which a new county, Caldwell County, would be created primarily for Mormon occupancy in sparsely settled lands northeast of Clay County. There, the Saints began building once more, and by 1838 had established several towns, including Far West, a thriving little community of 4,000 to 5,000, where a temple site was dedicated. In the meantime, however, troubles were brewing in Kirtland. A bank sponsored by Joseph Smith without state authorization had failed. Local citizens were stunned to find their investments frozen, and they placed the blame on Smith. Threats against his life soon surfaced. By early 1838, the situation became so grave that Smith fled Ohio, joining the Missouri Mormons at Far West. By the time Smith arrived, the Mormon presence was already causing anxiety in neighboring counties. As other Ohio Mormons arrived in Missouri, conditions worsened, and in October, open violence broke out. After several confrontations, the governor ordered the Mormons to leave the state or be exterminated. Later skirmishes led to several deaths, including the massacre of 17 Mormons huddled for protection in a blacksmith shop at Hahn's Mill. Joseph Smith was jailed in Liberty, Missouri. The Saints, in the dead of winter, made their way eastward across the Mississippi to Quincy, Illinois. Residents there welcomed the refugees with compassion and cared for their needs. How did the Missouri experience shape the Mormons? First, it made the theme of unjust persecution an indelible part of their consciousness. From that time on, the retelling of stories of mob violence, of threatened extinction, and of forced flight became almost a ritual. This further widened the gap between Mormon and American societies. In addition, they gained in Missouri repeated experience in the founding of new settlements. Though painfully acquired, these skills would later prove invaluable. The Mormons' last Midwest settlement site was on a broad bend of the Mississippi River north of the refugee camps at Quincy. Purchase of lands began in April 1839, shortly after Joseph Smith escaped prison in Missouri and rejoined his scattered flock. Under a liberal charter from the Illinois legislature, this city, called Nauvoo, grew rapidly. The Mormons founded an embryonic university and organized a disciplined town militia called the Nauvoo Legion. Many of the homes they built evidenced their commitment to a permanent settlement. Doctrinal developments in Nauvoo were dramatic. They added a strong Old Testament flavor to the religion and injected elements which seemed almost calculated to provoke non-Mormons to try the faith of the prophet's most loyal followers. Especially inflammatory was the initiation of plural marriage, the taking of more than one wife. Plural marriage had been secretly communicated in practice since at least the early 1840s. In June 1844, a group of dissenters set up a newspaper which was openly critical of Smith's leadership and exposed the practice of plural marriage. Smith, as mayor, called a meeting of the town council, which ordered that the press be destroyed. This violation of the long-held American principle of freedom of the press brought an immediate response from non-Mormons. Smith was jailed in nearby Carthage. On June 27th, an armed mob broke into the jail, shot him and his brother, and fled. After some uncertainty, most Nauvoo Mormons chose Brigham Young, president of the Mormon Apostles, to be their new leader. Joseph Smith's death only temporarily appeased those who feared and distrusted the Mormons. In September of 1845, anti-Mormons began burning Mormon homes in outlying settlements. Church leaders responded by announcing that they had been planning an orderly, gradual evacuation for some time and would begin to leave Illinois in the spring. Mob pressures increased, however, and on February 4th, wagons were ferried across the Mississippi. By coincidence, that same day, another group of 238 Mormons embarked from New York in the ship Brooklyn under leadership of Sam Brannan. Mormon converts from the state of Mississippi were also organizing companies to head west and join the Saints. And in August, a government recruiter enlisted a battalion of Mormons to march to San Diego as part of U.S. military operations in the Mexican War. Thus, by the winter of 1846, there were Mormons camped along the Missouri, Mormons heading north from Mississippi, battalion Mormons heading both southwest and northwest from Santa Fe, and Mormons in California, all planning to rendezvous the next summer in one of the valleys of the Rocky Mountains. It was to be an exodus of major proportions, and one that would transform Jedediah Smith's old home in the wilderness beyond recognition. As this band of Mormon refugees fanned out across the American West, they and their adversaries would have agreed on at least one thing. They had become a peculiar people, quite unlike the Americans who had driven them far beyond the borders of the United States. Their prophets' teachings and their historical experience had combined to put a distinctive stamp upon this people. They developed a strong sense of community. And they nurtured the feeling that somehow they had a special relationship to God and owed him special obligations. This belief caused them to see themselves as somehow separate and distinct from the world. And one of the obligations they felt they owed to God was a strict obedience to the authority exercised by their leaders. So this sense of community, together with this almost instinctive willingness to respond to trusted authority, made the Mormons a remarkably unified and orderly people. So what did all this mean to Utah? It's interesting that in 1846, several trains of immigrants came through Utah. Some of them liked the place, but none of them stayed. Utah was too remote, too far from markets and sources of supply in case of famine, too distant from civilization. New settlement in remote lands had always taken a great toll in lives and in resources. Such enterprises had usually succeeded more out of luck than out of pluck. But surely there was never a people better equipped than the Mormons to settle a remote and distant land. They'd already founded new settlements 4 or 5 times before. They developed a distinctive subculture with traits that made them ideal pioneers. Their sense of community, their respect for authority, their commitment to unity and order within their society, now, as they moved far beyond the frontier, would greatly favor their enterprise.